Welcome to our 77th podcast for Thanks for Your Service and the first for 2025. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net and you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, was the strategic point for the Allies in World War II, including hosting thousands of Australians. Meg Adams has recently contributed to a book titled In the Fight, Australians and the War in Burma, 1942 to 1945. Meg talks to us about the contributions and support of Allied troops in Ceylon by units and some of the volunteers and aid workers, including some remarkable women. So joining us on the line is Canberra-based historian Meg Adams. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka as we know it, is key to the story that you're about to tell. Can we start with why Ceylon is central to what you're about to chat with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the story of Australians' involvement in Ceylon during the Second World War is not especially well known. And so I do think that the context is quite important here. So most of us are aware of the historical and geographical significance of Ceylon. Most of us know that it has been used as a stopover for troops making their way to and from far corners of the globe, particularly during the First World War, for example. Ceylon was an important stopover during the Second World War as well, but it was actually during this conflict that the nation begins to play a pretty significant strategic role. And this actually occurs after Japan's invasion of Malaya at the end of 1941. So, as we know, this invasion culminates in the fall of Singapore in February 1942, and then that's followed by many other neighbouring countries which also fall to the Japanese in the weeks and months which follow. Now, the fall of Singapore is significant to Ceylon for two main reasons. So, firstly, it results in the loss of a key Allied base, and secondly, it shows the Allies that Japanese forces were formidable. Many had previously believed that Singapore would not and could not fall to the enemy, that it was a fortress, it was impenetrable. And so Japan's victory there absolutely proved otherwise. So the loss of Singapore therefore meant that a replacement base would be needed to some extent. And it also meant that Allied forces could not safely assume that places such as Ceylon would not become targets for the enemy. So Allied forces in this respect could not afford to lose Ceylon, particularly as it was vital to maintaining control of the Indian Ocean. But it's during this time as well that the fighting continuing throughout Southeast Asia and also in Burma leaves Ceylon only a few months into 1942, almost surrounded by hostile or soon-to-be hostile nations. So as you can see, this sort of rapid chain of events early on in the war brings about significant change for Ceylon and the role that it would go on to play in the Second World War.
So let's now focus on the Australian connection with Ceylon and the story that you're about to tell us today. And the troops, our troops returning from the Middle East campaign, how did they end up in Ceylon, or why did they end up in Ceylon?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a bit of an interesting story in itself as well, isn't it? So it's around this time, as you've said, that a number of Australian units were returning from their service in the Middle East. And it was decided that some of these units should actually be diverted to defend Allied interests that were closer to India and Southeast Asia. Around this time, Britain actually sanctions a diversion of some of these Australian units to Burma, where Japanese forces are making a pretty rapid advance. But the Australian government rejected this proposal. And as sort of a middle ground, I suppose, it's agreed that the 16th and 17th Brigades be diverted to Ceylon, where they would provide temporary reinforcements to the island in case there were any further enemy attacks there. So you have that Australian presence there initially, but of course, over the course of the war, there is also a number of Australian aircrew serving out of Ceylon and a number of Royal Australian naval vessels too. And this presence becomes particularly important actually in April of 1942, when Japanese forces directly attack Ceylon in what has become known as the Easter Sunday raids. And some people are not necessarily aware that Ceylon was actually attacked during the Second World War. And it was obviously very scary for those living and serving in Ceylon, but the attacks caused significant damage for the Allies. And this included the loss of two British heavy cruisers, so Dorsetshire and Cornwall, as well as two Australian ships, including HMAS Hermes and HMAS Vampire. So you have this quite significant damage, some pretty scary attacks going on, indicating that Ceylon may be in the enemy's sights. But in addition to this presence of Allied forces defending the island, you also have a number of Allied personnel who are transiting through Ceylon on troop and hospital ships through this time. And so over the course of the war, there are a lot of Allied personnel, many Australians coming in and out of Ceylon. And so although Ceylon is not necessarily always considered at the forefront of sort of mainstream histories of the Second World War, there was quite a significant Allied and indeed Australian presence there throughout the war.
Yeah. I mean, one of the key reasons we're talking with you today is because I met you recently at a conference in Melbourne hosted by the Military History and Heritage Victoria, where you spoke about a book that you've just contributed to. And it was a book titled In the Fight, Australian and Australians and the War in Burma 1942 to 1945. And in that book, you detail the crucial work of key groups who supported the Australian diggers in Ceylon and the Burma theatre. Who were the groups?
Yeah, well, Australians had many varied roles in Ceylon and in the Burma theatre. My chapter specifically looks at the role of a few key groups. So they are the voluntary aid detachments, the Red Cross, the Australian Comforts Fund, and also the British branch of the Young Women's Christian Association, amongst which there were a number of Australians working. So, yeah, quite a few different and varied groups.
And what were the roles of each group? So if you could just take us through a bit of a profile of each of the groups you've just mentioned.
Absolutely. So these groups played a pretty key supporting role in Ceylon during the war, particularly if we start with the voluntary aids, for example. They were sent to support the 2nd 12th Australian General Hospital, which had been established just north of the capital of Colombo. And they kind of fulfilled the role of nursing orderlies there and played a pretty significant role in supporting the treatment of Allied personnel. When you look at other groups like the Australian Comforts Fund and the Red Cross and the Young Women's Christian Association, they play a really key role from a logistical perspective in securing goods that were required, using those sort of global networks that they had to source very basic things like toothbrushes and pajamas and things that troops might have needed, particularly when you consider shipwreck sailors and that kind of thing. Securing those and making them available to people in Ceylon, but also things like visiting troops in hospital, helping to supply hospital ships. A number of these organisations also established rest and convalescent homes in Ceylon. So they played a really, really important supportive role during the war and made a significant impact on the lives of many of the Allied troops that were serving in or transiting through Ceylon during the war.
I think one of the significant things about all these groups is that the majority of their personnel, if not all, were women. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
There were several outstanding women in those groups that you highlight in the book. Can you tell us a little about, say, two of them? Of
course. I mean, there are so many amazing stories throughout my chapter and, of course, throughout the entire book that I contributed to. But there's a couple of women who I think their stories particularly stood out to me. The first of those would probably be the story of Gladys Collins. So Gladys Collins was among the first batch of voluntary aids to be sent to Ceylon in early 1941. It was a very exciting posting, I think, for her and her colleagues because they were the first voluntary aids to be permitted to serve outside of Australia during the Second World War. So it's quite unusual, quite exciting for them, and they're going to a pretty unusual location. As I mentioned earlier, Gladys and her colleagues had been sent there to support the work at the 2nd 12th Australian General Hospital at a place called Wellisara. And they had a number of really interesting experiences during their time at the hospital. They're treating the sick and wounded. They're looking after different refugees and injured personnel that come through after the fall of Singapore in different circumstances. They're even fighting off snakes in their sleeping quarters. So very, very different for a lot of these girls who hail from some of the main cities within Australia. But Gladys Collins' story, is particularly interesting because on one occasion during her time in Ceylon, she was on leave in Colombo. And she comes across a number of Red Cross workers who are helping the sick and wounded ashore. And they're somewhat outnumbered. And so rather than just walking away, Gladys jumps in to try and help them and throws all of her efforts into supporting the Red Cross efforts. And on that day, her work is actually witnessed by the Assistant Commissioner of the Red Cross, and he actually applies to have her transferred from the voluntary aid service into the Red Cross. He was so impressed by her that he actually thought, this is a woman that we need to have in our team. And so this request was granted, and Gladys went on to spend years and years working for the Red Cross in Ceylon. And she earned a little bit of a reputation during this time, particularly for taking the Red Cross launch out into Colombo Harbour, where she would climb aboard troop ships, climb aboard hospital ships, to visit the sick and wounded, to offer to get them supplies, and in many cases even to hunt down souvenirs for personnel who weren't able to come ashore themselves. And becoming a bit of an icon for this work, she earned the nickname of Harbour Gladys, which I think is quite heartwarming and quite fitting. And her story sort of in Ceylon ends around 1944 when she marries a British lieutenant by the name of Patrick Smith, and they're married in the city of Kandy. But as I said, I think her story is just wonderful and really shows how these women were willing to just pitch in and apply themselves in a huge range of situations. So yeah, a very, very interesting one there. And for a second story, the other woman I think that comes to my mind is Mary Mears. So Mary Mears served with the British branch of the Young Women's Christian Association that I mentioned earlier. But she had a really long history of voluntary service, particularly to veterans within her community in Western Australia. So she was born around 1889, and she was a volunteer with the Red Cross during the First World War, and she also worked in a voluntary aid detachment during that conflict. But sadly, during the First World War, she lost her twin brother and also her sweetheart as a consequence of that. So it was a conflict, I think, that became very personal for Mary. In the interwar years, she continued to devote herself to the veterans' cause. She volunteered, undertook a lot of philanthropic work, and did so much in the interest of veterans that she became a much loved and iconic figure in the community, and was known sort of very broadly as a friend to diggers, is what they called her. And so when the Second World War breaks out, Mary Mears, of course, wants to continue this work, and she feels she'd be best placed to do this overseas. But she was a little older by that stage, and so she was rejected for service outside of Australia. But this didn't stop her, as you can imagine. She seems like she's a bit of a force to be reckoned with. And she continues her work on the home front. And then around 1944, she secures a posting to Ceylon with the British YWCA as a welfare officer. And in Ceylon, her main role there is helping to establish and run a jointly operated YWCA and Australian Comforts Fund house for service women in Colombo. So she played a really key role there in providing something quite unique and quite special for service women who were also doing it tough, very far from home. But after the war ended, Mary Mears spent 12 months or so in India, where she managed a club for recuperating prisoners of war on behalf of the Indian Army. And she was later stationed for a short time in Burma before returning to Australia around 1947. And it was in that same year that she was actually made OBE. So she certainly got wonderful recognition for her services there. But it didn't stop there for Mary Mears. For the rest of her life, she continued working for these voluntary organisations. She was foundation president, I believe, of the Western Australian ex-service women's, sub-branch of the RSL. She's also on the medical board. So she really did a lot in this community. She passed away in Perth around 1964, but really dedicated her life to the service of others. So I think for me, the stories of Gladys Collins and Mary Mears definitely stood out to me in my research.
So why have we not heard more about the contribution of the groups and the women in these groups?
I mean, it's a great question when you consider what an impact these women had and how interesting their stories are, right? But I think one of the things that In the Fight does really well as a book is to highlight the stories of so many Australians and their wartime experiences that have remained unknown for so long. In the case of my chapter, I think one reason is that Ceylon as a theatre of war hasn't held a popular or significant place in people's remembrance of the Second World War. And so it's not necessarily something that comes to the forefront of people's minds, at least in Australia, when people think of the Second World War. So a lot of Australians don't even realise that there were Australians serving in places like Ceylon, India and Burma. And similarly, I think, because many of the people in my chapter were volunteers, they don't often appear in more mainstream histories. And in some cases, people like Mary Mears, for example, don't have traditional service records that allow us to easily trace their experiences and develop a fuller understanding of their role. So those are some of the difficulties. I think as well, particularly with regards to women, I mean, women's histories have traditionally not been seen as perhaps as important or relevant, particularly in military contexts. So that's another barrier that I think has prevented us from really understanding and getting a grasp on what the experiences of these Australians were and what these women were doing so far from home. But as we can see from our chat today, I think that volunteers in Ceylon made such an important contribution to the Allied war effort. And all of the individuals that I discuss in my chapter and all the individuals who are discussed in the book have really, really interesting stories. And I certainly feel very proud to have been able to play even a small role in bringing some of these stories to light.
Yeah, absolutely. And the chapter of the book, or your chapter in the book, is called Proud of Their Part, Volunteers in Ceylon. The book, again, is called In the Fight, Australians in the War in Burma, 1942 to 1945, and has just been published by Big Sky Publishing. Where can people go to grab a copy?
Yes, I mean, the book was only launched last month at the Shrine in Melbourne, so it's very exciting, very new. I believe people can grab a copy at Big W and in QBD bookstores, but it's also available with lots of online retailers like Amazon and Booktopia. But there's so many interesting stories to be discovered in this book.
Where can people go to find out more about the groups? Are there any other particular reference sites or reference materials that you can suggest?
Oh, of course. I mean, I go in to more detail about all of these groups and all of these individuals in my actual chapter. But if any listeners would like to delve a little bit deeper into these stories or do some research of their own, there are a couple of books that I would recommend. The first would be Proud Story, which is the official history of the Australian Comforts Fund. And this gives a really nice overview of the role of the fund and also has a dedicated chapter on Ceylon. So that's definitely a good starting place. Another wonderful reference is Rupert Goodman's Voluntary Aid Detachments in Peace and War. This book is one of only a few that's actually published on the history of voluntary aid. So it's a great starting point for research on this particular group, as is Melanie Oppenheimer's Power of Humanity. So this is a history of the Red Cross in Australia over the past century. And it does a wonderful job at really tracing that role and highlighting how meaningful their work has been during that time. I think as well, if any listeners are more curious about Ceylon during the war more generally, there's a British historian by the name of Ashley Jackson who's published extensively on this and has a number of interesting books and articles online that listeners could definitely refer to. Further to that point, the Second World War official histories are all available online, are another great resource. So there's plenty of great information out there from a secondary material perspective on books and that kind of thing. If anyone at home is looking to maybe do some more primary research, Trove is a wonderful starting point if you want to look through some newspapers that are freely available online and they're searchable, as well as places like the National Archives of Australia and the Australian War Memorial, which hold a lot of, primary material in terms of private records, service records, on individuals who served in these theatres, which may also be of interest to people listening at home.
And what a great insight into these fascinating story about the contribution of these groups and, more importantly, the women in these groups. Meg, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's the podcast for today. Meg's chapter is titled Proud of Their Part, Volunteers in Ceylon. The book In the Fight, Australians in the War in Burma 1942 to 1945 is edited by Andrew Kilsby and Daryl Moran and is published by Big Sky Publishing. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews helps new listeners find our podcast. And if you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. You can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history, research packages, sources, records to better understand the service and experience of those who've served. You can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.